The streets of the Cape Flats carried an electric fear the night Cameron Wilson prowled. Shadows lingered longer in alleyways, and parents kept their children close, whispering warnings behind locked doors. Wilson, barely out of his teens, carved his name into Cape Town's memory with a brutality few have ever seen. By the time police closed in, he had terrorized whole neighborhoods, leaving behind unspeakable horror and broken lives. With each crime, he seemed colder, more untouchable, wearing both his gang ties and a chilling lack of remorse. Like armor, his story doesn't just chill the spine. It exposes the raw nerves of a city at war with its own darkness. True crime fans still pore over the details, searching for answers in the bloodstained timeline of his attacks. What happened in those grim months gripped a nation. Wilson's crimes haunt the city and serve as a stark warning of what can happen when humanity turns predatory. Tall, cracked buildings and narrow streets mark the Cape Flats, a region carved out on the edge of Cape Town. Flooding forced thousands here decades ago, displacing families and breaking tightly knit communities apart. Amid rows of boxy shacks and battered homes, the air hangs heavy with uncertainty. Many residents wake each day gripped by a single question: will I make it home safe tonight? This is the backdrop against which Cameron Wilson rose, and where violence, hope, and heartbreak fill every block. Life in the Cape Flats has long been shaped by the power of street gangs like the infamous 28s, 26s, and the Americans. These groups took root during apartheid-era demolitions and have since grown into large criminal syndicates. For many, gangs aren't just a menace. They dictate how you live, who you trust, when you leave home, and even where your children can safely play. Residents talk of constant turf wars. Gunfire rattles windows at night, marking boundaries and warning rivals. Extortion and fear. Shopkeepers and families pay protection money just to be left alone. Recruitment of the young children, as young as 8, are lured by status, protection, or the promise of cash. Relentless poverty, few jobs, and poor schools mean a future shaped by desperation. Gangs exploit this hopelessness. They offer belonging, money, and an identity, a steep cost. The result? Ordinary people live by unspoken rules, scanning the streets and listening for gunshots. Those who cross gang boundaries or resist their demands often vanish from these battered neighborhoods. Living in the Cape Flats means everyday routines become acts of survival. Parents walk their kids to school not just out of love, but because it's not safe to let them go alone. Cameron Wilson grew up surrounded by these pressures. His childhood, like many on the Cape Flats, was a study in survival. Parents working long hours for little pay, empty fridges, crowded rooms, and neighbors haunted by violence. The streets became his classroom, and what they taught was brutal. Key influences on Wilson's path: broken home environment. Many accounts suggest instability at home, leaving young Wilson without consistent guidance or safe spaces. Violence as normalcy. Fights, threats, and gunfire weren't rare. They were part of the scenery. Wilson learned early to use violence as both shield and weapon. Gangs and role models, with older teens and adults flashing money and confidence. Gangsters became the closest thing to heroes. Joining a gang offered status and protection, but also demanded loyalty to their brutal code. Lack of opportunity, high unemployment, and failing schools left few other paths to adulthood. Living in a constant state of want and fear, children like Wilson could slip easily into crime. Psychologically, growing up surrounded by danger can change a child's mind. Signs of trouble: coldness to others' pain, quickness to anger, disregard for rules are often missed or ignored when survival is the only priority. Wilson's own violence started small and grew with each test of the gang code. From the outside, his story might look like fate, but it was built by daily choices made under pressure, in a place where gangs shape futures and hope comes at a price. The Cape Flats, already fragile, became the hunting ground for a predator who learned his darkest lessons in its streets. Between 2014 and 2016, Cameron Wilson unleashed a storm of violence on the Cape Flats. His crimes hit fast, often without warning, leaving families shattered and a community living in dread. Wilson started with single acts of cruelty, but his attacks grew bolder, as if he was testing just how far he could push the city's limits. This section lays out his bloody trail, victim by victim, painting a chilling picture of a teenage killer, growing more ruthless with every crime. The story of Wilson's violence began in October 2014. Toyher Stober was Wilson's first known victim. Shot dead, the crime sent ripples through the neighborhood, but police chalked it up to the violent gang world that gripped the Cape Flats. Not long after, Alfonso Van Roosen was found stabbed to death. Eyewitnesses later described chaos as neighbors tried to piece together what happened. But Wilson's name barely came up. These murders weren't just random acts, they marked the start of a new way of killing for Wilson. Each attack was personal, up close and cold. Both Stober and Van Roosen never saw it coming, a sign that Wilson moved with purpose. His violence, once hidden in the shadows of gang feuds, was becoming unmistakably his own. By December 2014, Wilson's attacks had escalated. Ernest Erasmus was murdered on December 26, 2014. This was not a quick killing. Instead, Erasmus became the latest victim in a tightening web of fear. The details were grim. Erasmus was attacked with a weapon and left for dead. The savagery of the murder shocked even hardened locals. Rumors of a serial killer on the loose began to swirl. People grew suspicious of strangers and scanned faces at bus stops. These deaths, close together in time and brutality, fed the panic. Wilson gained confidence as fear spread, slipping further from the reach of police. Parents began to walk there, children everywhere, locking doors long before sunset. In September 2016, Wilson's violence exploded with a cruelty that stunned the Cape Flats. Lakita Moore, just 18, was targeted in a crime that showed a new level of brutality. What happened that night is difficult to read, but it's important to face the truth. Wilson lured Lakita out under cover of darkness. Manipulating her trust, he stabbed her at least 50 times, leaving her body on a sand patch in Valhalla Park. Police found her half-naked and battered. The community awoke to screams and sirens. The sight of Lakita's wounds made headlines, shocking even police veterans. The aftermath was immediate. Angry crowds gathered, some blaming gangs, others the police for failing to protect young women. Lakita's family, in tears, pleaded for justice as her friends left flowers at the scene. For many in the Cape Flats, this was the moment Wilson's crimes became impossible to ignore. Lakita's murder shined a spotlight on the dangers women faced and on the chilling power one man wielded over an entire city. Wilson didn't stop with Lakita. Over the next months, he continued his attacks, claiming yet more lives. Some key patterns emerged in these later crimes. Stacey Lee Mohali became another of Wilson's victims, killed in the same vicious style. Her murder followed shortly after Lakita's, deepening the sense of dread. Wilson's attacks often targeted young women, many of whom knew him or encountered him in social settings. He stalked his victims, using charm or threats to get close. Weapons of choice varied, sometimes stabbing, sometimes shooting, always quick and overwhelming. Other victims' names have faded among the public, but their families still live with the scars. With each killing, Wilson grew more brazen, as if testing how far he could go before someone stopped him. The community's trust sank even lower. Neighbors traded warnings about Wilson, and police posted extra patrols in the streets. Yet, the murders kept coming, matching a grim rhythm that held Cape Town hostage. Only after an intense police operation did Wilson finally face arrest, but by then, the damage left behind was nearly beyond words. Cameron Wilson moved through Cape Town's Cape Flats like a shadow, part of the streets, but never fully seen for what he truly was. Surviving among scars left by gangs and poverty, he wore his violence as a second skin. His crimes revealed a pattern, one that mixed cold calculation with raw brutality. To truly understand what drove Wilson and how experts interpret his mind, we must examine the tools he used, the tactics he favored, and the disturbing findings of those who studied him up close. Wilson's methods struck terror, not just because of what he did, but how he chose to do it. He blended in, often hiding his intentions behind a mask of normality until it was too late for his victims. His crimes followed clear, chilling patterns: close-range violence. Wilson favored stabbing and shooting, acts that require proximity and a readiness to see the effects firsthand. This wasn't impersonal. It was up close and devastating. Weapon of opportunity. While he sometimes carried a knife or firearm, he used whatever was at hand. The unpredictability kept both police and his victims guessing. Sudden attack. Victims often had little warning. Wilson used surprise, striking fast and with overwhelming force, extreme force. Multiple stab wounds, vicious beatings, or repeated shots characterized his killings. He showed a determination not just to kill, but to destroy, targeting the vulnerable. Most of his victims were young women or individuals unlikely to fight back. This predatory calculation was part of his method. Gang connections. Wilson learned violence in gang territory, where brutality is currency and fear rules the streets. But his crimes often went beyond gang business. He killed not for profit or territory, but for the thrill and sense of control. Police and community members described scenes that were almost ritualistic: bodies left exposed, wounds intended to shock. The message was clear and terrifying. Anyone could become prey. Wilson's motives were layered. Gang loyalty played a role, providing some sense of justification for his violence. Yet, witnesses and investigators pointed to something more troubling: a delight in cruelty, a cold curiosity about what it felt like to inflict pain. He seemed to thrive on the chaos he created, knowing each new crime made him more infamous among both friends and enemies. When experts studied Wilson, what they found was beyond troubling. They didn't just see a violent man, they saw a textbook case of psychopathy, a personality carved by trauma and honed on the streets. Key findings from forensic assessments and court-ordered psychological reports included profound lack of empathy. Wilson consistently failed to show concern for his victims or their families. When questioned, he gave flat, emotionless answers or attempted to shift blame. No signs of remorse. Those who evaluated him described a total absence of guilt. Apologies, if offered, were perfunctory mechanical words with no emotion behind them. Emotional detachment. Wilson interacted with psychologists and police without anxiety or shame. He recounted horrific acts as if discussing a mundane event. This disconnect made him even more dangerous. Manipulation and superficial. Charm. He sometimes tried to charm or deceive his evaluators. Moments of friendliness that quickly faded when he didn't get his way. This trait is common among severe psychopaths. Gang trauma, not an excuse. While Wilson's upbringing among gangs exposed him to enormous trauma, experts were careful to separate cause from effect. Community violence can warp a young mind, but Wilson's patterns of cruelty, lack of feeling, and repeated offenses set him apart from other gang-involved youth. What does this mean for his future? Forensic psychologists offered little hope. Wilson was rated as having an extremely high risk of reoffending and a very low, impossible likelihood of rehabilitation. These assessments rest on decades of clinical knowledge. Psychopaths make up a small portion of the population, under 1%, yet account for a large share of serious violence. Neuroscientific research demonstrates that psychopathy is linked to brain regions responsible for empathy, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Signs appear early in childhood, and by adulthood, patterns are often deeply entrenched. In simple terms, Wilson's crimes were not just acts of violence, they were classic signatures of an individual, almost completely cut off from normal human emotion. He was labeled a predator by those who studied him, a person who could mimic feeling but never actually feel for his victims. For the people of Cape Town, these findings only deepened the sense of violation. Wilson didn't just hurt bodies, he tore holes in the city's ability to trust, showing what real evil looks like when it walks unnoticed among us. As Cameron Wilson's crimes shook the Cape Flats, law enforcement faced major hurdles in bringing him to justice. Each chilling murder called for police to gather every clue and testimony with extreme care. Once arrested, Wilson's journey through the justice system was watched closely by a traumatized public eager for answers. Here's how police tracked a dangerous predator, what happened in the courtroom, and why the sentencing brought a rare sigh of relief across Cape Town. Hunting Cameron Wilson felt like chasing a ghost through a maze. Detectives worked through tense nights, determined to stop the flow of blood. The Cape Flats was a challenge-dense neighborhood, gang intimidation, and residents still afraid to talk about what they'd seen. Some steps police took that proved critical in closing the net around Wilson included forensic evidence collection. Officers scoured multiple crime scenes, searching for fibers, fingerprints, and discarded weapons. Blood spatter analysis, DNA from under victims' fingernails, and traces on clothing became vital. Survivor and witness statements. Despite real threats, brave survivors and witnesses came forward, their voices cut through the fear, describing Wilson's face, his tactics, and, in some cases, recalling chilling snatches of dialogue, linking patterns and behaviors. Detectives noticed Wilson's use of close-range weapons and his approach to victims. This pattern helped authorities connect separate attacks to a single killer, ruling out unrelated gang violence, gang intelligence, and informants. Officers leaned heavily on community contacts. Some gang members, hoping to escape prosecution or violence themselves, offered information that helped place Wilson at crime scenes. Digital and physical surveillance. Police collected phone records, tracked social media activity, and reviewed local CCTV footage, piecing together Wilson's movements before each attack provided the final threads. Evidence mounted, one piece at a time. The police's coordination with forensic labs and the use of advanced analytical techniques, like DNA profiling and crime mapping, solidified the case. The chain of proof was strong enough to stop Wilson's reign. Every scrap of evidence built the story prosecutors needed. When Wilson appeared in court, every eye in Cape Town seemed fixed on his every move. Victims' families crowded the benches. Journalists scribbled notes. Security was tight, tension thick in the air. Here's what defined those pivotal days. Victim and survivor testimonies. Witnesses, many young women, bravely took the stand. Their stories were graphic and emotional. They described attacks in painful detail, some shaking and crying as they spoke, refusing to let Wilson's intimidation silence them. Expert analysis and forensic proof. Forensic pathologists presented evidence of wounds, blood trails, and DNA matches. Psychologists testified about Wilson's chilling lack of empathy, supporting what many suspected about his psychological state. Wilson's demeanor and behavior throughout the proceedings. Wilson showed little remorse. Onlookers were chilled by his calmness, even as evidence piled up. To some, he seemed almost disconnected from the horror at the center of the case. Family anguish and anger. The family's pain filled the courtroom. Tears, outbursts, and heartfelt pleas for justice echoed after each day's testimony. Their grief was a driving force behind the prosecution's determination. Wider community reaction. The proceedings aired daily updates. Outside, crowds rallied in support of the victims and called for tougher action against violence. Social media exploded with discussions about safety and justice on the Cape Flats. The trial became more than just a legal process. It was a public reckoning with the city's pain and the way justice is done in South Africa. The bravery of those who spoke up began to pierce the fear that had cloaked the Cape Flats for years. But when Judgment Day arrived, the outcome was as harsh as Wilson's crimes demanded. The judge listened to every piece of evidence, thought carefully about each victim, and handed down a sentence that matched the weight of loss. The key details from sentencing: for life sentences, the court gave Wilson for life terms for multiple murders, with additional years for assault, attempted murder, and rape. There was no chance for parole. Cameron Wilson would never again walk the streets of Cape Town. Public relief and reaction. News of the sentence spread fast. There were scenes of emotional release outside the courthouse. Some families sobbed with relief, others embraced. For many, it felt like the city finally breathed again. National conversation. The verdicts sparked debates about criminal justice and protection for vulnerable communities. Victim advocates called for ongoing support for affected families. City officials promised to keep fighting violence and gang influence in Cape Town. Sentencing Wilson to spend the rest of his life in prison didn't erase the trauma or bring loved ones back, but it offered a firm answer: justice served, and a violent chapter closed. For a city scarred by fear, that verdict was more than a legal outcome. It was a momentary restoration of hope. The story of Cameron Wilson's crimes does not end in the courtroom. The echoes of fear and heartbreak linger in the Cape Flats, mingling with a sense of hard-won justice and the painful work of recovery. Survivors, neighbors, and families all wrestle with new realities. Some feel relief. Others carry scars that will never truly fade. This section explores how the families left behind search for healing and how the Cape Flats, forever marked by Wilson's shadow, faces today's challenges around safety and justice. For every headline about Cameron Wilson, there's a mother who wakes up to a silent house, a sibling who sets an extra plate by instinct, or a child who runs to a gate, hoping to see a lost friend return. The families of Wilson's victims live with holes that time cannot fill. The pain is personal. Birthdays missed, empty chairs, questions with no answers. Victims' families have spoken about raw grief. Many relatives broke down in court, clutching photographs and crying out for their children. They describe days so heavy that even breathing feels like a struggle. Ongoing trauma, the violence did not just end with the crime. Families relive the horror during trials, media coverage, and even at community gatherings. Hope through solidarity, grieving parents and siblings find strength in one another. They support newcomers forced into trauma by new tragedy, giving comfort only they can offer. Public outrage and rejection. Wilson's behavior in smirking, yawning, clapping, and taunting survivors sparked rage. Families shouted back from the benches, vowing never to forgive or forget. Their pain turned to fuel, powering calls for harsher penalties and stronger victim support. Yet, even in loss, there are sparks of resilience. Some relatives have started advocacy groups to support women's safety or push for changes in policing. They speak out, refusing to let their loved ones become just another grim news clip. The wounds may not close, but these families now walk together, finding ways to honor the lives stolen from them. Wilson's sentencing brought waves of relief. Across places like Valhalla Park, residents hailed his prison term as a rare symbol that the justice system could still bring answers and warnings to those who prey on the vulnerable. The streets, for a moment, felt lighter, but beneath that relief, old worries refused to die. In the wake of Wilson's arrest and conviction, the Cape Flats community has seen relief and praise for justice. Police and community leaders called the sentence a victory for detective work and survivor courage. Many agreed that tough sentencing helps restore trust. Ongoing fears, despite the verdict, locals still triple-check locks and keep children close. Wilson is gone, but the threat of gang violence and random attacks remains part of daily life. New calls for prevention. The story forced everyone to ask, what could have been done at home, in the schools, in the courts, to stop Wilson sooner? This led to louder demands for early intervention, trauma counseling, and safe spaces for at-risk youth, trauma helplines and support. Counseling services and trauma helplines now reach more residents than ever. Faith leaders, teachers, and community organizers coordinate to offer safe after-school options and mental health support. But not all wounds heal quickly. Some families feel uneasy knowing Wilson could, in theory, be eligible for parole after 25 years. They worry about other young men already entangled in gangs, fearing the next tragedy is only ever one moment away. The Cape Flats will never be the same. Wilson's crimes left scars, both public and private, pressing hard questions onto every street and home. How do you rebuild trust after evil has walked freely among you? How can a city protect its most vulnerable when violence seems woven into the day? These questions remain. But in the churches where candles burn for the lost, and in the living rooms where families remember laughter now stolen, there is a whisper of something more, a stubborn hope, threaded through pain, that the Cape Flats can still reclaim its future from the shadow of tragedy. Cameron Wilson's crimes carved deep wounds in Cape Town's Cape Flats, leaving a shattered community and forever changing lives. The raw fear and heartbreak his victims' families endure stand as a stark warning. When violence finds fertile ground, entire neighborhoods pay the price. These stories must not be buried or softened. Each victim's name belongs in public memory, serving as both a call to protect the vulnerable and a plea for early help for those at risk of turning violent. The lessons from this tragedy about trauma, warning signs, and the dangers lurking when the system fails echo throughout South Africa and beyond. Let these memories remind us to stay vigilant, to support those scarred by violence, and to build communities where such darkness can no longer take root. Thank you for watching this difficult story. If you have thoughts or want to share your own experiences, please join the conversation. Every voice matters when justice and remembrance are at stake.